Hello and welcome to the Service-Based Business Society podcast. I am your host, Tiffany-Ann. On our weekly episodes, we will dig into everything you need to know about scaling your service-based business without losing sleep. With my experience in creating over 7 figures per month and a passion for marketing, finance, and automation, this show will provide tangible tips and techniques for scaling your business. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to another episode. Today is a little bit of a different episode. I'm super excited to have our guest in the studio. We are talking all about podcasting today. So as of late, we have received so many questions about what it takes to have a podcast. Do I love podcasting? How did I get started podcasting? And we are almost at 50 episodes. We're coming up on 50 episodes at the end of season 2. And so when I had the opportunity to bring our guest, Julia Hickman, in on the podcast, I realized it was a perfect fit to answer a lot of these questions. So Julia is a wife, mother of 2, and business growth strategist specializing in podcast coaching. She helps heart-led entrepreneurs in the self-development and wellness fields launch and run podcasts that help them elevate their voice, impact, and bottom line. She's an avid podcast guest and has been featured on Authority magazine. And, we're going to dive in. We're going to talk about podcasting, how to get started, because yes, I have a podcast, but that doesn't mean that I am the expert in creating a podcast or any of the like. So we're going to bring Julia on and we're going to dive into this topic with her because I will say, I may not be the expert in creating a podcast or any of those things. We definitely have a team behind the scenes that helps make this podcast happen. But I will say I absolutely love podcasting. I love the ability to have these conversations with incredible guests and be able to share my stories and messaging and everything with all of our listeners across the globe. So welcome to the podcast, Julia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Happy to chat with you today.
Awesome. So let's dive right in. And, not the typical elevator pitch, but talk to me a little bit about how you got started in your business and how you are now working on your specific niche.
Yeah, so I've been an online entrepreneur for about 7 years, tried a few different things from blogging to network marketing. And then I eventually became a certified fitness and lifestyle coach. And I created my newest business, the latest business that I'm working on full time, which is podcast strategy. And the reason I started this business was because I had come to this place in my fitness business where I was like, okay, ready to kind of take this to the next level. I had just had a new baby and was feeling like, okay, I have an older kid too. I have this new baby. My energy feels like it's all over the place. And I feel like my business is taking me all over the place. So I had to really think about like, okay, do I want to try fixing this business or do I want to pause this business or do I want to close it entirely? And I ended up pretty much closing it because I felt that focusing on something 100% was the best way that I could actually find fulfillment, but also be able to deliver the best service to my clients. And what I found was that I loved podcasting. I had my own podcast. I've been podcasting on my own for 2.5 years. I've been doing the whole podcasting gig for about 4.5 years, being other people's guests. And it really became a great way for me to share my message, share my voice, and to give myself the permission to talk about things that maybe are a little bit uncomfortable, maybe things I don't really want to share on social media. But for some reason, on the podcast, it feels okay. It feels more aligned to me. And so I was like, okay, I want to help other people with this. I want to help other entrepreneurs who are heart-led, mission-driven, share their voice, share that soul message that we all have, and help them so they can elevate their brands and inspire others and really grow their impact in the world.
Yes. Yeah, podcasting is unique. I often share kind of about, vulnerability, and that's not something when I left the corporate space that was very foreign to me. there was no vulnerability sharing in the corporate space. And so
No.
then you make this shift into, okay, well, now you're supposed to be a personal brand and you're supposed to be sharing, who you are and your story and whatnot. And, when you're on social media and whatnot, there's different people there. It's funny. I still use Facebook for like its original purpose. I, have my kids in sports. And so you've got like, the moms from this team or the dads or the coaches. And so I do some business stuff on there, but not as much. I mean, Facebook business page and whatnot. But I do feel like the podcast is this more space where you can share more kind of the daily ongoings, different stories and whatnot. It's a different share for sure.
Yes, definitely. And actually something that I talked with one of my guests about is that there's this sort of like special magic that happens when somebody listens to your voice. It's a different feeling when somebody's reading your content than when they're like hearing it from you. So I was like, oh yeah, that's so true. I didn't even really think of that. But think about it. There's like, I'm not a very sciencey person, but like the frequency over a voice, right? Like the way you can, have different intonations, right? Like you can show your excitement, or if you're like upset, you sound different. So all that, people get to hear that and they can feel your energy. And I think that's so cool about audio, audio as a tool for connecting with people.
Yes. I pushed back on the whole podcast thing for a long time from a listener perspective. I always feel like I'm behind the time on the trends. And, at the beginning when people were talking about podcasting, and listening to podcasts, it was all Joe Rogan. Everybody's talking about Joe Rogan. And it was like, and legendary at this point. But, that was and I was like, oh, that's not really my jam. And so, I had no idea that there was this world of podcasts that, really you can listen and be a part of so many different things. I listen to podcasts about conspiracy theories and true crime and like personal development and some like super trash talk kind of like about the reality TV shows sometimes where you want to just like totally veg out, but don't have time to sit on the couch and, watch trashy TV. So that's a guilty pleasure of mine, or it used to be. So now you can just turn on a podcast and you do kind of feel like you get to know people as they're sharing their life and journey and whatnot.
Definitely. And I think it's so cool. Like celebrities now have their own podcast. So you can kind of get like the inside scoop on the things that we don't see about them on the trashy magazines. But yeah, it is definitely cool. And there's all the different genres. So I feel like I've even heard people say like, oh, I don't read the news anymore. I just listen to podcasts. And hey, that's true in many ways. You can kind of like self-select what you want to consume and what you don't want to consume.
For sure. So what types of people are you working with in getting their podcast started? Or are you working with people who have podcasts that are already existing and looking to level up?
Yeah, so we actually do both. So I help people with the initial launch, working with them with aligning the podcast brand to their, their overall brand, and then putting all the pieces together of having them think about like, okay, what's going to be the strategy? What's going to be like that initial strategy that we want? Do we want to have guests in the launch? Do we want to just be solo episodes? How many do we want? So there's a lot of little details that go into it. And then of course there's the whole editing piece, which people are like, that sometimes like gets people really frustrated when they're trying to launch on their own. They're like, I don't want to have to learn how to do this other thing and learn all this new tech. So we take that off their plate. So that's one thing that we do. And then we do like the ongoing management as well. And I work with different fields, really. I would say one of my favorite people to work with is because I have that wellness background. I love working with people in the wellness field, mindset coaches, even business coaches that have like that mindset theme in their work. But really, I love working with people who have that they're big mission driven,
right?
And who want to create abundance in the world, not just for themselves, but for, they want to have like this ripple effect that affects the world. And that's just really great because I don't know if I can do that on my own, but if I can help other people who want that and who have that big drive, then I feel like I'm doing good work.
What would you say, is there anyone that should not do a podcast? Is there a group of people? Is there a specific personality trait? Is there someone where you're like, in my experience, just maybe this isn't the right direction for you?
Yes. I feel like in my field, you'll hear people say like, oh, everybody, if you're a serious business owner, you must have a podcast. And that's not me. First of all, I would never try to convince somebody to have a podcast if that's not really in their heart.
Yeah.
But I would say if you feel like you need to start a podcast because you see other people like you, like who do similar work like you having a podcast and you're like, oh, well, I should because they're doing it. Thinking that you should is not necessarily a good reason to start a podcast.
Right.
Also, I would say, like, if you are like feeling very drained and you're like drowning in work, no, like work on that first, fixing that first, and then think about a podcast, right? Because a podcast is going to amplify something that you're already doing. And if you're doing things well, that's great. But if you have a lot of messiness going on, you're just going to add like a layer of stress that's meant to be not stressful.
Right.
So yeah, I would advise, like that would be the tips that I give somebody who's like, maybe I should have a podcast, but are you really ready right now?
Yeah. So if I go back to when I started my podcast, we started with some support with someone who came on and helped get things going because it's almost this overwhelming, you're like, oh, podcasts are available in so many places. I mean, you've got, your standard, but then when you actually start to dig into it, podcasts really get pushed out to even more places that get, for listeners and whatnot. It was almost overwhelming as someone who didn't listen to a huge amount of podcasts at that time. I was like, I don't even know where to start. So we started with some support on the strategy piece and getting the podcast up and going. And we started with 4 episodes. We had 4 recorded episodes and launched those all at the same time. I don't know that I would do it again that way, but that's kind of how we got going. And then, weekly episodes from there and alternating, guest episode, solo episode. And so, we're kind of wrapping up the end of season 2. We'll be 50 episodes by the end of season 2, which feels like a milestone.
Yes, it is. That's amazing. Congrats.
And so, always looking back, hindsight, you always think, oh, I would have done that a little differently or whatnot. So when someone wants to, change up their podcast a little bit, do you recommend, now you've got some traction and whatnot, do you recommend people, make some evolution in their current podcast? You say recommend start a new podcast. What is that? Because like you said, in your business, there's that time of transformation where you were trying to decide, should I pause or cancel my old business and start something new entirely? And so how does that kind of life transition piece transfer over into podcasting?
Yeah, that's a great question because I feel like sometimes I've seen people who completely stop their podcast and then start a new one. And I'm like, and if I don't know them, and I don't really know all the behind the scenes, it's hard to say. But what I would say is, if you're at a point where you're like, okay, I feel like I want to change the name of the podcast, rebrand it, target a similar audience, but like not completely different, you might not need a whole new show. You might not need to like stop what you're currently doing. You might just need to transition the show, let people know that there's a change coming. Like maybe you want to change the show. Maybe you want something that's a little bit more on target with your business, right? So then in that case, it makes sense to just rebrand the show. And that's actually what I did with my podcast because as a fitness coach, I was working with entrepreneurs and with like female professionals, career women, career moms. And so now in my business, it makes sense for me to continue talking to that same audience because, hey, career women might want to have a podcast too, right? Because they might want to create their own personal brands and stand out in their career. So for me, it made sense to just rebrand my podcast. Now, if you're going to be talking about a completely different topic or a completely new audience, that's where it makes sense to, start a new show.
Right. Yeah, I recently saw someone's creator online and he creates content in the smart home space. Really great content. And I'll link him in the show notes. I can't think of the exact name of the TikTok profile right now, but he does, installs different smart home devices and whatnot. And he actually went to his audience at one point and said, I want to share more about what it's like to be a creator in the space, how I go about, working with these different businesses and the financial side of that, and really just put it out to his audience as to whether or not they wanted that content on the same channel or whether they wanted to split that off. And I noticed just this morning that I was seeing some more of that like financial creator content on his existing. I was like, oh, the votes must have said, let's keep it all together. And so, that's often one of these things when we're doing things in our business and adding pieces or subtracting pieces. In 2023, I've been really focusing on niching down, Canadian versus American, and so have kind of looked at, okay, like which pieces logically still fit together and whatnot. So I thought that was an interesting way of doing it. Although a podcast, of course, is a little more one-sided communication wise. So you don't always get that feedback that you can't, not like TikTok where you say comment below.
Right,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's when it's helpful to have a community elsewhere. A lot of people use Instagram as a way to communicate with their audience because it's like a simple way where somebody can message you and it's not, it's sort of easy to chat on there. Whereas like I know Facebook, for some reason, like podcast listeners and Facebook Messenger, it doesn't translate as well. So yeah, so you could, and not necessarily have like your own podcast account on Instagram, but you can still like make sure you have like a podcast stories cover, so that you can link your episodes on there so that people that are following you on Instagram know that, hey, you have a podcast and they can go if like if somebody's looking through, they can find your past episodes on there. But yeah, that could be a great way to get people to talk to you who are listening to you on the podcast for sure.
Right, right. Yeah, we have a Facebook community, and I would say it's about a third maybe podcast listeners, and the rest are typical, like our business clients and whatnot. We've really kind of just created that one singular space. And again, don't know if I would do it that way again, but that's kind of what we're currently rocking. I'm so anti-Instagram. The thought of doing more Instagram, I'm like, oh, I don't know about that.
I don't blame you. Instagram, I feel like it's fun to create content on there. That's what makes it fun. But then you get stuck on there. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been on here for 20 minutes and I've accomplished nothing. Like, get me off this app.
Yes, yes. My children who are both, like working on their sports and stuff, they, there are other kids on their teams that have Instagram profiles. And so this was this latest thing where they wanted Instagram. So I started with my daughter, who's the older one, and she's had Instagram now for a while. And, she doesn't have it unsupervised. She does some things and I help and whatnot. And then now my son, of course, is like, well, but now I'm the same age as when she got hers. And so I said to my husband last night, I'm like, gosh, I feel like I've taken on like this new social media manager gig, all these new things and whatnot.
Yeah. Oh
Yes.
my gosh. I can't even imagine that yet.
How old are your kids?
I have a 7-year-old and a 2.5-year-old.
There you go. Yes. Yeah. Mine are, turning 10, turning 8, and almost 4. So yeah, the 10-year-old and the 8-year-old are the ones that are, and it's all really just mostly sports stuff and whatever else. But yeah.
That's great.
So working on a podcast, and, a lot of times I actually have a close friend who she paid someone to get her podcast going. Same kind of thing, like let's create the podcast channel and the strategy and the first 10 episodes and whatnot. And then she's been stalling for a year and a half. Wow. And we talk about it regularly. She's a friend of mine. And I'm like, just record the episode. And she is so bubbly and outgoing. She goes live all the time. She's got a huge following on TikTok and YouTube and whatever else. And so, but she does more short form video content. And so she's, and so now there's kind of this almost like a mind block in terms of like recording these podcast episodes. And I'm the opposite. I would way prefer the podcast to video content, 100%. And so she thinks, we always laugh back and forth because, she's like, you record every week. And I'm like, yeah, no problem. It's so interesting how just different people, I would assume that she would have had no problem doing it. And so I razz her all the time. Record the first episode. Got to do it. Record it. Did you do it? So someone who is overwhelmed by the thought of the editing and what would I even talk about and whatnot, is that something that you help them work through in terms of getting those episodes done and not running out of things to say?
Definitely. I would probably say that's one of my things in my zone of genius bucket. Yeah. But yeah, I definitely love helping people. First of all, like kind of like change their mindset a little bit about how it's going to be more content to create. Because the reality is, especially if your friend is already active on TikTok and wherever else making video, she already has content. Like she already has content that she could then repurpose on the podcast. It could be as simple as like even using the audio from some of those videos, or it could be like going back and being like, oh, in this video I talked about XYZ. So why don't I do a podcast episode that pretty much says the exact same thing, but now I'll just be a little bit more intentional about it because I've already talked about it, and now I can kind of like really know what I want to say and just make sure I'm speaking to like that one person, right? Because when we're on a podcast, especially when we're doing solo episodes, we want to be like we're whispering in somebody's ear, right? It's one person versus like on video, you're addressing like 50 people who are watching your video or whatever it is, right?
Yes.
So it's just about making that little change. But It really doesn't have to be so much more and so stressful, or it's just about like planning ahead and having an open mind and being willing to repurpose, which I feel like as smart business owners, we all want to maximize what we're already doing, right? Just like we want to maximize, our, like with your background, like maximize your income, right? And like your revenue and all that stuff. You want to maximize your content, right? You don't want to lose content that you worked so hard to create. So why not repurpose it?
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting because we talk about it all the time. I'm like, have you done it yet? Have you done it yet? Because I'm like, come on, girl, get going. She's paid up all the money, which I think is often time, when people are going to take on a new project, whether it's I'm going to launch a YouTube channel, I'm going to launch a podcast, I'm going to write a book. There's a time element and there's also this, financial investment into doing so. And I think that oftentimes it's, hey, I don't have the, funds right now to launch something new, or I don't have the energy time. And so, I'm like, you're halfway there, just keep going, which is my mantra for 2023, just keep going. When it's uncomfortable, when you feel like, oh, I don't know if I can do this, keep going.
It does get better. It really does it gets easier.
Yeah, I mean, because we're now at the end, like near the end of our second season. And I can say at the beginning, there was more stress about the editing, the editing style, the, making sure that the podcast episodes, when there was more people involved in the editing and whatnot, it was almost took a little longer. So there was some like, oh my goodness, it's going to be done in time and those kinds of things. And now it really does, it feels more like a well-oiled machine for sure.
Exactly. And I've had the same experience because when I started podcasting, I wasn't a podcast strategist. I didn't have a production company, right? So I was doing everything on my own. And even listening back to some of the first few episodes that I recorded, I say and I say like, but the thing is that that's me. And at first I was like, oh gosh, I need to go back and like remove some of those because I don't, it doesn't sound as professional. And then I'm like, you know what? If somebody's going to judge me for that, then I probably don't want to work with them, right? So I just want to sound like who I am. So I, stopped worrying about that. And even now I have an editor who works on my podcast and on clients' podcasts. And I'm like, you don't have to don't go crazy removing any of my ums and anything like that, because that's how I talk. And I think also as you do, the more and more that you do, you start to become more aware, right, of how you sound, and you stop yourself and you pause a little bit, because that's what helps me not say as much as like taking the time to kind of think about what I'm going to say. So it all comes with experience. It all comes with like the more that you do it, the better you get at it too.
Yeah, right back to that, just keep going. It's the same. A lot of clients, short form video is a big thing these days. And, it's this, oh, I don't know. What if it's not good? And you know what? Chances are there will be lots that is not good. I could go through our short form video and think, oh, I wouldn't do that again. Or, like, oh, why did I should maybe not share. But you just have to keep going, because all of those people who are so good at it, because there are some creators that are truly incredible. They can pack in, entertainment, experience, value, everything all in 59 seconds. And you're like, that's great. But everyone started somewhere.
Exactly. Yeah. I always say no one's born an expert. We all start at 0 and then we get better from there.
Yes. So, now someone's launched their podcast. What is that next step? What is, when you're talking about your services specifically? So we kind of talked about, yes, there's this strategizing, getting it created, getting it going. So now someone is further along in their journey and they're ready to take that next step. What does that look like?
Yeah. So this is really usually somebody who either has been doing it on their own, or maybe they've had like an editor, just somebody to help them with that editing piece, but they're still the one who's like creating the show notes and trying to put out their episodes out there on social media, their email, wherever they are, right?
Yeah.
But they're starting to realize that, hey, this time that I'm spending a few hours on this every week. I could be using this time to do like a higher income generating activity, right. Whether it's doing more sales calls or maybe going on other people's podcasts, like something that's going to move that needle for me more. So like, I'm ready to hand this off to somebody else. So yeah, so that's where we can come in too. And the approach that I have here is to really be the partner in somebody's podcast, sort of like, if you're familiar with like an OBM, like an online business manager, right? Like they're usually there to help a business owner, help them with a strategy. So help them a little bit more with like the the thinking piece, like the thinking and the visioning, or even like, what's the other word? There's OBM and there's like DOO, like director of operations.
Yeah.
So think of me as like that for the podcast, but not only the podcast. Like, so when I work with somebody's podcast, I look at their whole business, like I look at their whole marketing.
Right.
Because if you are just doing if you're just kind of doing to like do your podcast, but it doesn't align with everything else that you have going on in your business, it's going to just be like this heavy thing that you're doing. And it's going to feel like it's expensive and time consuming, and you're going to want to stop doing it. And like my goal is to, again, like I want to support people who are mission driven and who are they have important messages to share. So like, I don't want them to stop sharing that message. So I want to keep supporting them so they keep reaching out to people. So it's about being their partner, helping them like really think about how this fits everything else. And then also like being the expert in podcasting, right? Because podcasting, it's still like this very new industry. There's so many new things coming up. Like even in like the main hosting site that we use Libsyn.com. And there's like new things that they add. There's always new things that come up. Like, oh, now you can share to this thing. Now you can do this thing on there. So like by having me on their team, like I can share that with them. They don't have to go and like try to figure out like what else to do, like where else to get their show on. So it's just like all those little things too, where it's like, if somebody is, let's bring it back to marketing, right? Let's say social media marketing. So if you are a business coach or any kind of business owner, right? So business owner, and you know that you want to be on TikTok, but you don't know how to strategize I don't know. You don't know how to do that. Like you don't know how to create a TikTok. You don't know how to make sure that it's working for you. It's the same thing. It's like having somebody who's like, I know that platform and I know how to make it work for you. So that's the benefit of like having me or having any expert in somebody's business, especially if they're ready to go to that next level. If they're ready to go from like 6 figures to 7 figures. That's when you really have to start thinking, how can I bring somebody on who's going to help me think? So I don't have to be the one thinking about all the things.
But you can. And, it's such a great point about experts, because I actually just this morning had a sales call with someone who I know through a local networking group. And ironically, her kid goes to the same elementary school as me. So, in the online space, it's not super common that you're literally working with someone that's right down the road. And so, but she came on because she had a QuickBooks question. And so we do so much bookkeeping, and it's an area that I am super knowledgeable and passionate about. And she just had a question about bringing some information from her Stripe account into her QuickBooks account. It just wasn't jiving. And so I said, hey, let's just jump on a call and like walk through this issue. And so then she was like, well, I have you. And so we were talking about these other things. And she's like, I just don't even have the time to even like explore. Like, we were looking at this different integration piece, and she's like, there's so many options. And that is the expert, whether it's in social media marketing, whether it's in TikTok, whether it's in YouTube or podcasting or bookkeeping. When you're hiring an expert, they know the ins and outs of the different platforms. A new feature comes out and they are exploring that feature and decide, and then can say, yes, it's great, or no, we're not quite ready to use that, or it's not even relevant to you. The number of things, we get questions all the time from clients. They've seen something on social media, or they've seen something in the news where it's like, oh, there's a new tax deduction, or there's a new this or that. And it's like, hey, I want to do this. And you're like, oh, well, actually, that totally doesn't apply to your business because of X, Y, Z. They're like, oh, thank goodness, like, and no additional time spent. And so that it's talking and working with experts, because you can't be the expert in all of the things. It's just, you would spend all of your time just researching all of the things and never get anything done. And so something so much to be said for working with and building the community of people that you can pull that information from. So important.
Exactly. 100%. And it's also like when you can kind of like follow the tried and true methods and apply them to you, that's when like things start to feel more easeful. Like I'm not a QuickBooks expert by any means, but like, using QuickBooks, for example, and like knowing how to implement it for your type of business, right? Because somebody who has a lot of like a product-based business, it might look completely different for them than for somebody who's service-based, for somebody who has like a large group program than for somebody who runs a small like consultancy, right? So it's all about like, how does that apply to me and how do I make it work? How do I make this thing work for me in like my specific situation? So yeah, so that's really cool.
Yeah, especially on the bookkeeping side, because you can go from super simple, I get this much in revenue each month and I pay out this much expenses and this is my profit. And so, you really can. There's like some definite DIY bookkeeping that can happen there. But then people start adding in as their businesses scale and grow. And it's like, well, you know how to use the QuickBooks program now, and you've been doing this on your own for a while and you're good to go. But then, you add in inventory, or you add in, you're a subscription thing, or you add in where you're sending a quote and sending multiple invoices. And you can see that each of these adds like this little bit of complexity. And then, it's like, oh, I'll figure it out. And then it's, creates big mess typically. And so, but sometimes, just like the call this morning, sometimes it's just getting that insight from someone who understands and that strategy. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to an ongoing service, but, reaching out and connecting with experts to get that information in your business so that you're at least on the right path.
Definitely. Yeah. So with you on that.
So if people want to, they've been thinking about having a podcast, or they have a podcast and they're looking to level up, they're wondering, maybe this is the right thing for me, maybe it's not. How would someone get in contact with you? How would they work with you?
Yeah, so definitely check out my podcast. It's called the Elevated Femmes Movement. I have a 3-episode series. I believe it's like episode 56 through 58. Somewhere around there, where I talk about like who should start a podcast, like what to think about before starting a podcast, how to maximize a current podcast, and some of the main things that I think somebody should think about when they're either starting or already running a podcast. So check out those episodes. And yeah, I'm also on, if you have any questions, like if you want to make sure that the podcast is the next right step for you, or if you have a podcast and you're like, look, I think I'm like really ready to maybe get some help and you just want to talk and see if maybe you would be a good fit, definitely reach out on social media. I'm active on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. Those are the main places.
Awesome. How do you find LinkedIn? I feel like it's a lot of cold messaging over on LinkedIn these days.
There is. I have just started like actively using it for about a month. So I'm still quite new at it. What I found though is that if you can sort of get a little community going, then the people start seeing that and you start to get traction. Because I'm getting pretty good traction now after a few weeks of just sharing content, and I'm not there every day. Like one of the marketing coaches in the business coaching program that I'm in, she's like, you should be there every day. I'm like, 3 times a week. 3 times a week. That's what I can commit to.
Yes,
and it's still,
totally.
I'm still seeing traction. So again, it's all about like, make it work for you, right?
100%.
Whatever it is that you want to tackle, make it work for you.
Yes. I think that applies to everything. You'll go in and people who are doing really well on TikTok, I've heard so many times, you need to share 3 TikToks a day. And if you're not sharing any TikToks a day, to go to 3 TikToks, it's like a huge, overwhelming jump. But I think it comes back to this whole piece where, well, 1 a day or 3 a week consistently is still better than none. And so when we get into this whole, like, you should be there every day or you should do 3 a day, and you think, I can't do that, so then you don't do any, there's like this disconnection. And so it comes back to that, like, keep going, get started, get practice, you'll get better, and just keep going.
Absolutely.
If you had a tip for someone to implement in their business today that they could get that quick win, that they could get them going in the right direction, what would that be for you?
Yeah, I think one of the main things that I've realized is that there's probably, like, if you're looking to be like, okay, I want to either make a connection with somebody, maybe collaborate with somebody, like be on their podcast, or I really would love to get a sales call. Look at your warm leads. Like, look at who has already been interacting with you. Look at who has shown interest in the past and start there. Because I feel like a lot of times, and even people that want to start a podcast, they come to me and they're like, so how quickly will I grow my audience? Right. And it's like, all right, that takes time. I do not promise an overnight result ever, because podcasting is a long-term strategy. So if your desire is to get like a quick win, to get something like tomorrow or next week, start with what's already in your network, what's already in your experience, right? And start there, and then worry about the long-term stuff.
Yes. I think it's, podcasting is not a short-term strategy, nor is SEO. People come to me that's another service that our agency offers is the SEO, and people want to rank at the top and they want to rank at the top right now.
Yeah.
And, SEO is not the way to do that. It is a long-term strategy. And I think that it's always a balance of short-term strategies. It's almost like golf, the short game and the long game. You need a good balance of both because you do need that forward momentum and you do need those immediate wins to get, keep things going. But you also have to be investing into the more long-term things that are going to pay off in the long run, but that are, podcasting is a great example of something that is definitely a more long-term strategy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Julia, thank you so much for being here and sharing your knowledge and information about podcasting and taking it to the next level and whatnot. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Tiffany-Ann. Thank you for having me as your guest.
Well, we are all out of time for today. If you guys have not joined the Service-Based Business Society Facebook community, make sure you head on over to Facebook and we can continue the conversation. Be sure to also follow the show by going to any podcast app and searching Service-Based Business Society, click subscribe, click the 5th star,